So today we have the great privilege and pleasure to have Dr. Pankaj Sekhsaria, who teaches at the IIT Mumbai, IIT Bombay. But he wears many hats. He has been working on a very particular landscape in India. We'll talk more about is the Andamans and Nicobar Islands. But subsequently, he's also been doing writing extensively on the sociology of science and the processes which go inside it. His detailed biodata and his extensive writings you'll find in the links on this page. But today we want to explore with him what kept him in this particular landscape of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. What is this landscape? Why is it important? Because he's invested several years of his life on it. And through that, we unravel some of the importance ideas which lead to thinking of multi-species worlds. So Pankaj, I'll just open with asking you, what are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands?
So, hi Ravi, and thanks for inviting me firstly to this conversation. So let me jump straight to your question. So it's a small group of islands. I mean, when I say small, it's relative to say some of the other larger island groups of between say 600 and 800 big and small islands located in the Bay of Bengal, which are believed to be the peaks of a submerged mountain range known as the Arakan, which comes down in an arc from Myanmar in the north down into Sumatra in the south, Sumatra in Indonesia. So there are two groups, like you mentioned. One is the Andamans, which is in the northern part of this island chain, and the smaller group, both in terms of area, number of islands, and population, is the Nicobars, which is the southern group of the islands. And they are both ecologically, I mean, they're one unit, but at the same time, from what little I know, they're also distinct quite ecologically. Human communities that have been there on these islands traditionally have been different in some ways. And they've been great subjects of curiosity for a very long time. There are, of course, issues of rights, tribal rights, and all that. And the two groups are also interestingly separated. And I think there is some interesting geology and biogeography there by the 10-degree north latitude that kind of runs between the two islands. And it's also called the 10-degree channel. So that's very, very simply and very straightforward kind of sense. The islands, they belong to modern India. They were the site of a penal colony by the British, who we know created the cellular jail there. And it has a very interesting and complex history, but kind of jumping straight into the present. It's about 1,200 kilometers from mainland India. So for anybody who knows the islands, of course, this is very basic information, but since you asked me to explain it to you for the Indian context.
They're like in the middle of almost nowhere, the middle of the ocean. They're not close to.
Yeah, so they're probably closer to some of the Southeast Asian island nations. So Sumatra is probably 100 nautical miles from the Great Nicobar Island, which is the southernmost island in the group. So it's a continuation of that kind of landscape or seascape or whatever we want to call it. And it's a biodiversity hotspot, some very good tropical forests, reasonably high degrees of endemism, which we see on island systems, a very rich coastal and marine system, and there are the complexities of history of what I have written and other people have interpreted as, say, a second colonization of sorts of these islands in many ways. It's located in a very seismically active zone. So that brings another dynamics to that whole landscape, which makes it very fascinating. There's an active volcano there.
Oh, really?
It's very amazing, the tectonics of the place, and actually what happened in 2004, the December 2004 tsunami and earthquake, where we all remember the islands and that whole event for the tsunami. But in places like the islands, and I've written about that in articles and in my book and all that, of how the tectonics and the earthquake actually probably had a larger impact and a longer term impact, because, and I find that absolutely fascinating. And I say that because for me, that has kind of become one of the key pivots of the understanding of the islands for me, because what happened on December 26, 2004, and if you, there's a lot of evidence of that now, is like, in a child's playground, we have the seesaw. So one side goes up and the other side comes down.
Mm-hmm.
This is how the islands tilted permanently on that morning. So parts of the Andaman Islands in the north came up permanently by about 5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And the Nicobars, for example, the southernmost point, the closest to Sumatra, a place called Indra Point, experienced a permanent submergence of about 15 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a huge shift that takes place. It has implications for people, for the coastal ecology, for forests, etc., etc. And it is, it's the underlying reality of the place. It's an underlying reality of how the islands have been created and how they are. They have an earthquake on an average once a week. That's kind of, it's seismic zone 5. It's one of the most active zones of the world. And this has implications of many things. Historically, and particularly in a development context. So what happens when you have a landscape which is so earthquake prone? You have a landscape where what was land till yesterday, today morning turns into sea because you've seen 15 feet of submergence, and 15 feet of submergence is no joke, right? That's a conventional house is a foot and it's like 2 stories of a house going permanently under. What happens if you develop or you do huge constructions there, which is the latest battle we are fighting with this huge Great Nicobar project. I just wrote about it in the Hindu the day before. You may have seen it yesterday. And you're proposing to invest 70,000 crores at creating a port and creating an airport in a pristine landscape, which has seen 15 feet of submergence 15 years ago. So there are these very interesting.
So before I come to this,
sure.
I'm also curious to know what drew you into that faraway land. How did you land up there, and became a long-term observer and researcher and activist? You're one of the few people who I know who have been fighting about this and raising this issue. You continue to do that. You bring out a regular newsletter for a very long time now. So what draws you, keeps you there?
So I went there 25 years ago as a college student, had some time on hand and had nothing to do. I had a friend there and he said, why don't you come over? So I was already interested in environment and wildlife then. And in some senses, for all of us, and it continues to be, it's like a dream location, because the idea of biodiversity and wildlife and the ocean and the forest. And also, I went there for a couple of months. I was at a loose end. And to cut a really long story short, it's like I was smitten by the place at that point of time. I met some interesting people. I traveled quite freely and just saw the place. I saw turtle nesting. I had some idea of what the forest was, and then I kind of wanted to go back. And then when I finished my master's, I had this opportunity through Kalpavriksh, which you have also been associated for a very long time. I started to work got associated with Kalpavriksh, and we wrote up a little project proposal, got some funding, and because I just wanted to go back, and I fortunately that money came through, and I went and then spent 6 months there at a stretch. And I think at that point of time, you're also looking to do something that you think is meaningful and justifies your work. So this was a bit of an investigative kind of project of sorts, and with some good fortune and some things working out well, we were able to, I still remember, get out some interesting information on some violations of forest laws, or some sand mining on the coastal areas, and violation of the tribal kind of laws and all that. And I put that together, and then Kalpavriksh, along with a couple of other organizations, took this to court as violations of some of the environmental and the kind of tribal issues in those islands.
Did the coastal regulation zones apply there?
They do apply, and there is actually also a special provision for the island zone. But at that point, it was not so much about the coastal zone per se. Of course, it was about the coast and the forest and the tribal issues. So we took this to court, and then in some senses, it took a life of its own, because the court decides something, then we had to go to the first to the High Court, then we went to the Supreme Court, and I was quite centrally involved in the whole thing. So in some senses, I had to continue to engage.
Yeah.
So that was a compulsion, but on the other hand, it was a great place to go to, and to travel. There is a sense of mystery, there is a sense of beauty. So I kept taking those chances of going back, and I started writing, started doing photography. So in some senses, it's completely been a unstructured journey. Last few years, I have not been able to travel to the islands, but I've continued.
Journeys are, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I've continued to.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just asking you to continue. Last few years, you haven't.
I haven't been able to travel there for various reasons. But I've been part of very large networks, some of which I have facilitated myself. So I keep a tab on the islands. I follow what's happening there, and occasionally, actually more than occasionally, also there've been highlighting issues and raising concerns on things that are happening there. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is.
It is, these landscapes are fascinating. Not only as an idea, they have something in them which draws us to them. And so you mentioned the idea of biodiversity there. Can you share what kind of biodiversity? What makes it different? What do you see there, which makes it special?
So one is just the greens of the forest, for example. I mean, they're absolutely fascinating, and the scale of the forest, the physicality, so to say, from a. So that's one.
These are tropical forests.
These are tropical forests. We are talking of, being at about 9 and 10 and 11 in the latitudes. So this is very much in the tropical zone.
Close to the equator.
Very close to the equator. So Great Nicobar, which is the southernmost tip, is like 6.5 degrees north latitude. So it's really just. Mainland India also, Kanyakumari is almost pretty much on the equator in that sense. So we are very much in the tropical zone. So that richness is there. And that forest is full of, amazing life forms, birds and butterflies and reptiles. Of course, we know very little. The herpetologist or the ornithologist will know more. But within what a common person in interest knows, you see fascinating things. The flowers, the trees. It's a very fascinating coastline because 600 islands with a very indented coastline, very rich mangrove forests, the intertidal zone, very fascinating, for example, beach ecosystem with a large number of turtles nesting there, 4 different species of turtle nesting. And then there is, of course, the ocean, which is not studied much. Some of these areas, very rich coral reefs. And we don't know. This is an island system in the middle of the ocean. What larger species, dolphins and whales. And I've had the occasion of seeing dolphins once or twice. So, it's so rich. The marine system, the coral reef systems, different islands, big islands, small islands. So it's such a rich and diverse and thriving matrix,
and it's sort of cut off from the mainland for a very long time, millions of years probably, or
more. I don't remember that history. I don't have the numbers, but yes, for a very long time. So we have very high degrees of endemism.
Right.
We have plants and animals and butterflies and herbs that are very unique to the place.
Right.
So many of them that which are even not known today, and any, like I always realize that any new substantive research always throws up something that is interesting and new.
Right.
So it's really rich in that sense, and
might have its own evolutionary impulses.
Perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
Should be, absolutely.
Yeah. And what about the people who have lived there? Who are the?
So that's very interesting, because there's the indigenous communities who for whom also the way we call them, and as we go along, these things have changed. So they used to be called in a particular way earlier. Now that's not politically or correct or acceptable anymore, for instance, and for good reasons. But there have been, broadly, from what I know, there are 6 communities that have been here in these islands for forever, for thousands of years. So there are 4 groups that are located in the Andaman group of islands, and there are 2 kind of different groups, so to say, who are located in the Nicobar group of islands. And these are, except for one group, perhaps, what is broadly known as the Nicobari community. The other 5 groups, 1 in the Nicobar groups and the 4 in the Andamans, are very small groups. You know, in some senses, the classical hunter-gatherer in the forest, roaming around. And I'm being very careful with saying the right words because I am not so fully.
These terminologies have now.
Correct. And they have their own baggages and their own challenges. And
correct.
So they are
the indigenous peoples there.
They are the indigenous peoples there who are very small numbers and continue to be increasingly threatened through the last 200 years of I think takeaway of forests, denial of access to their resources, cultural changes, impositions, kind of an osmosis or an interaction with settlers who have come. So there's a complex history out there. So that's in some senses one might say the first peoples of those islands, as it were, who have been there for now. Some work in genetics seems to suggest for 30,000-40,000 years.
Okay.
So they, in some senses, are the original people.
Yeah.
But over the last 200 years, starting with the British efforts to set up a penal colony, a whole other set of people have were taken there, have started to go there. And there are, it's a multi-layered, very complex history, which we actually don't know about the islands. And I am also only slowly uncovering that. There are people that were, a small group of people that were brought in from Burma by the British.
As part of the penal colony.
No, it was not a penal colony. They were perhaps as administrators and, stuff like that.
Administrating the island,
helping with that, or maybe other things also. I'm not too sure. So this
workers or laborers or
probably. So this is one set of people from Burma, which was the Karens. The Karen community came around the same time at the turn of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. A whole bunch of people were taken from Chota Nagpur, actually recruited through the church in Ranchi. So there are these, the members of the communities from that landscape, the tribal communities, the Mundas and the Oraos and the Santals. There's a huge population of those people in those islands.
I see.
And they're all called the Ranchis because they were recruited through Ranchi.
Okay.
Then much later, for instance, I think in the 70s, when there was the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord about the Tamils, there was an agreement to repatriate some Tamils back into India. And there was one set that was actually sent to one particular island in the Nicobar group. And they have kind of settled in, and they've not settled in. That has been an area of conflict where they don't want to continue there anymore. Then in the 70s, there was a whole bunch of mainlanders. A lot of them actually ex-service staff, and a lot of them were from Punjab because it was a effort at kind of saying that this is Indian territory. And they were given huge patches of land, and many of them are not very happy because
such a big shift from Punjab to
exactly
belong there.
Exactly. And also there are, so it's very fascinating to see what may have happened. And those stories have also not been told in a sense. The full details of those stories have not been told. Then there was a whole bunch in the 60s and 70s where, people from East Pakistan were settled in these islands. An entire resettlement program was created in these islands. That was a major settlement. And again, I'm not very pakka with the dates on that, but I'm talking of the 60s and 70s. So you have there's another very interesting set of people who are actually the descendants of the people who were imprisoned in the cellular jail. So those families who in some senses don't have linkages to the mainland, whereas everybody else has some linkages. These people are more like there's even something called the local born association,
right?
So it's a very, very interesting mix, and increasingly there have been conflicts over land, over resources, over stuff like that. So the story of the islands has so far been largely about indigenous people and outsiders.
Yeah.
And in some senses, for a long time, people like me have been guilty of also that, not perpetuating, but that is the frame in which we have looked at it. But I think as you grow older, you understand a little more, you realize that there are layers within that.
Call it like a continuing colonization of that land, in a sense, because you want to have politically, you want to make it your own. And the indigenous people are one group there. The original settlers are one group there, but this is extension of the nation state. So, which continues in the way we look at landscape.
Yeah, I think that there's good, interesting evidence of that, Ravi, because there is something that I have written about and used, that there is a 1964 or 65 report. It was called a report, I forget the name, but a kind of report for development of these islands, put together by some set of bureaucrats or whatever experts in Delhi who went and spent a few days in the islands. This was when they were planning the resettlement. I think the lands were to be made available for refugees to come in, and
I see.
And there is this is a 1964-65 report, and I still remember the first time I came across it 25 years ago. There's a chapter in the chapterization of this little book of 100 pages, which was one of 2 or 3 developmental plans, so to say, visions for the islands. There's a chapter which is titled Colonization.
Oh, interesting.
So in a sense, because we all live in colonies in cities of Bombay, Delhi, and Pune on the one hand, but what did that colonization mean, for instance, and why was that choice made? How innocent was it, and how much was it what did they mean when they said colonization?
Yeah.
Did they mean that they will create settlements of people? One wouldn't have said, if I give them the benefit of doubt, one won't say, oh, I want to be a colonizer.
Yeah.
But the use of language, and you will understand that so much, how much
the
images we create and the language we use reveals as much as it conceals. So, and these are not innocent choices.
Right.
The frames that we make and the words that we use are deeply embedded with our value systems.
Yeah.
And in that narrative, in that story, because there were already some people, and there was conflict between the settlers and the Jarawa community, which was a tribal community there, and was attacking people because for some reason they perhaps felt threatened. Now, this report of these high flyers from Delhi, perhaps, in reporting what is happening in the islands and reporting the experience of the outsiders, refer to the forests of these islands as Jarawa infested. Now, the Jarawa community is a community that has been therefore infested. Yeah.
So you're talking about the Jarawa community, which is called infested with Jarawa.
Yeah. So this report says Jarawa infested forest.
Yeah.
Now, even if it is not their opinion, if it's a reportage of what other people are saying, people who have come to these islands 10 years ago or 5 years ago refer to the original inhabitants as infestations. And for a committee to just replicate that narrative, because see how it performs, right? Language is performative.
Yeah.
So I use this example in my class often. So Jarawa infested as against Jarawa inhabited as against Jarawa owned.
Yeah.
The way we look at the landscape and the people changes instantly with the change of one word.
Yeah.
But I'm just responding to your colonization question. So what does all this indicate?
Yeah.
If it is not even if it is not an explicit attempt at colonization, it betrays a certain way of looking at landscapes.
Yeah.
And I think that I'll just say one point is that one can understand, I would argue, in the context of that time. You're talking of the 60s. You're talking of a certain vision of the world. You're talking of a certain idea of the country.
Yeah.
Biodiversity was perhaps not even a word in the English language at that point of time.
Yeah.
So that was then. But what is the situation today?
It's not much different, is it?
It's not much different, because I use this example often. This political commentator Ashok Malik, who's Delhi-based, and he writes a lot on politics and all that. And there's a 2014 article of his, for example, just one of many examples, not his but others, of writing in the Hindustan Times, and he talks of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as a prized piece of mid-ocean real estate.
Wow.
That policy gurus in Delhi have neglected in the geopolitical strategic context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mid-ocean real estate. Now, so from being infested to becoming real estate, I mean, is that all that is? And so, and why is that? How does that continue? How does that kind of keep perpetuating itself? Is a reflection, of course, of the larger thinking, of the larger context in which we are living.
Yeah.
And it's very
interesting contrast between a kind of colonial mentality towards nature. And I'm not talking in terms of British or in modern Indian state. I'm talking about the idea of nature, because that's the time in the 1960s and 50s when the first big hydroelectric power projects came up in India. The Damodar Valley Corporation came up, the Bhakra came up, and they keep coming up because modernity was closely linked with the idea of science and technology.
Yeah.
And so land was just a place for harnessing something, or a section of community, forgetting and it's only very recently that we've started questioning that as an idea which is part of sustainability.
Yep.
So there is though the hands have changed in terms of who owns the land, in terms of the British or free India, the idea of nature continues to be inhabited in the same way, and the indigeneity is always thought of as not required. And I think that threat continues in what I've read from your writings, that they continue to face these modern threats, both from disease and from incursions and people trying to go and meet them, etc. And they are sort of don't want to do any of these things. And we know so little about their ways of life because they're not accessible. And maybe it's a good thing they're not accessible in a sense. But when I stopped you in the beginning, you were talking about the new plans for, one thing which boggles my mind is, even as a development approach, why would you want to build any large infrastructure on land which is so fragile, interconnected islands from a substrate where if one sinks, the other rises. So it's like a plate, common plate. And it's in the middle of the wide ocean where any ripple anywhere can be a tsunami on it. Why would you invest on it? What is that mind frame through which we continue to have this idea that we can control this?
I have no clue, Ravi. It completely baffles me. It completely baffles me. Is it ignorance? Is it a kind of an arrogance? And I mean, you mentioned earlier about sociology of science and technology, and that's a useful lens sometimes that it becomes a useful lens to try and understand some of these things, perhaps. But it completely beats me as to what the logic of that might be. I mean, on the one hand, you see, like you say, the fragility and the vulnerability.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what is the viability? I mean, both ways.
Yeah.
So is it just a grandstanding on scale? So the logic of one is that, Singapore and Hong Kong, and they're doing so well, and if they are doing this, we have this island, we will do the same thing. But I mean, is it even comparable to begin with? So what is the vision? Where is it coming from?
Is it also a militarized zone?
So there is a military, I don't know whether militarized zone might be the right word, but there are strategic concerns. And I mean, that is one of the narrative and the logic of the whole thing. And that does make it even more, doubly complex.
Yeah.
but the scale at which some of the development is being proposed, and in a completely uninhabited land, almost uninhabited. I can't even comprehend the kind of thing that's happening. So this Great Nicobar, this one island in the extreme south, for which there was a public hearing just the day before yesterday. And since you mentioned your project was going to be public hearings in the EIA process, and which there's a series of articles over the last
plan which they have come up with.
So I mean, one of my new engagements in the islands over the last 1 year has been about this particular project, and I've written a series of almost 10-11 articles now. Over the last exactly 1 year, starting in February, we are back on, like the 1st of February. In a little island, I mean, not little, but 70,000 crores investment is proposed in one island, with a port project, an airport project, in a pristine island with 130 square kilometers of pristine forest to be taken over. They are building a port in a bay, which is the most significant giant leatherback nesting site in the entire country. They are exactly that bay they want to build this port. And they say that they will do mitigation by which they will ensure that the turtles continue to nest, when they are going to build a breakwater that will restrict the bay opening from 3 kilometers to 300 meters. So the turtle won't be even able to reach its nesting site. I mean, what mitigation are we talking about? This is an island with 8,000 people who live today. The proposal is in 30 years to make the population of these islands 4 lakhs.
Wow.
How many times is that? The total population of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, 550 islands today, officially is 5 lakh people. And on one island, you want to put that same number of people. It is, we've been, people have just responded, and such a badly done environment impact assessment, which is, for you, it's not a new story. I mean, this is the story of EIs in this country. I've just looked at some of the responses that there may be 400 objections that people have been able to make of that EIA. 400 different objections, and all scientifically and procedurally valid. It's not somebody's. So much incorrect, inaccurate, inappropriate information in a report, which will become the basis for such a huge investment.
And the total destruction of the ecosystem.
I mean, what else? I mean, what else can happen? I mean, whether this can even be implemented, I'm not sure, because you can't even take a ship to that island with all this material that you would want. So right from the very beginning, who is doing? I just completely beats me. And I just might take this example of in 2009, because I find it amazing. In 2009, in a defense seminar in Port Blair, this is just 5 years after this earthquake and tsunami of 2004, where I said islands have seen submergence of 15 feet and uplift of 5 feet. 5,000 people officially died in a very sparsely populated island system. Tectonic changes, we say, you see that example with, it was a 9.3 Richter scale earthquake that happened off the coast of Sumatra, the Banda Aceh. That is 100 nautical miles from Great Nicobar. So it's like the earthquakes happened right there. Right there. 5 years after that, in a defense seminar, former President Kalam, in a defense seminar, in his vision for these islands, he was speaking in Port Blair. He proposes a 250 megawatt nuclear power station in those islands.
My God.
My God, that's the response. Where is that coming from? What does it mean? I mean, what will you do with so much power in those islands?
You can't transport to the mainland anymore.
You can't evacuate it. I mean, that's what I was going on, and then somebody said, that's all fine, your environmental concerns, but what will you do with so much power? Where will it go? So what are we thinking? Even if there's a benefit, what happens if there's a disaster? So it continues to baffle me. And I might just add, there is, in sociology of technology, there is interesting work that I've been using as a juxtaposition. So there's this scholar called Sheila Jasanoff. She speaks of the technologies of hubris and the technologies of humility. And there is in the 30s and 40s Lewis Mumford. He speaks of something very interesting parallels from what little I've seen is the monotechniques and the polytechniques. And they talk of technology as so the monotechnique and the technology of hubris, they kind of overlap, and it's about technology of control. It's about certainty. It's about scientific certainty. It's about knowing everything. Whereas the polytechniques and the technology of humility account for the fact that we don't know, or should account for the fact.
This is a very good segue into the second segment of our conversation, which I want to draw you into. And I have two impulses why I want to draw you into this. You have a long expertise and observation and involvement in the scientific justification of projects which have ecological destruction, like the process of the environmentalist impact assessment in our country and other names in other countries. So there is this whole rubric that science done properly can fix and avoid disaster to landscapes. It has no relationship with culture, no relationship to relationships with nature or to other complexities which might lie there. So it's a very sort of looking at a polyvalency kind of situation from a very single lens. The second is your extensive work on the sociology of science and technology, where you've written on laboratories and that. So you have been a unique observer of processes. So taking on sort of from what you just started talking about and framing it like this, I want to hear from you because this sort of beats the imagination. It goes beyond colonization. It goes into something like there is no recognition of the world we are living in. At one end, we are talking of climate change, ecosystems, disaster, etc. On the other hand, we continue on our journey to just fiddle with large landscapes through science, technology, and those kinds of intervention. They seem like two different worlds we are speaking about. And so anything which you might want to say about this as an observer of science, as an observer of the idea people have about science and certainty, what you just started talking about, idea of processes such as the EIA, which then become justification, then people have to then bring in other values. And what are these processes? For example, what are the kind of things considered in an EIA?
So, I'll come to the question of the EIA, a specific question later, but, more than the outcome of the processes, what are the processes themselves? So, one of the most interesting things I find in this sociology of technology, STS, what's more specifically science and technology studies this field, there are interesting analogies, and they have been contested in the literature. But for example, the idea of the front stage and the backstage. Now, it's a very, very obvious kind of thing. So sitting in a theater, you see a fantastic performance, smooth as silk, everything is choreographed, everything works. That is the front stage. Just step backstage and you know what mess there is. So what is showcased is the front stage. So what is the front stage is the policy. What is the front stage is the scientific paper. What is the front stage is the output. But all that happens in the backstage, for good and bad reasons across fields, we don't know, we don't get to know, we don't want to show. But that's where the story is. That's where the front stage has been created. And so this STS has allowed me to kind of, it's given me the methodological tools and the possibility of going backstage, conceptually and literally, so to say, that to understand that there is a backstage. And that's where so that's as important a part of the story as what eventually turns out. And even if it is not of any, for a moment, we can argue that just to understand, as a story is a good story. A story does not have to, some of the problem with storytelling is that, and particularly for children, for instance, we always want to embed a moral, but we don't need to do that. What a good story is that just engages the reader or the listener.
Right.
A good story is not one that gives a value or a moral. So just from that point of curiosity perspective, I think if you look at that, you see it's so fascinating. And without telling somebody, you see how different factors play a role. What happens in the process? How is policy made? Just uncovering those realities makes something evident, and people are then free to take their call. And I have kind of increasingly seen myself drawn into that space. And I mean, I say that because, from a Kalpavriksh activist position, who you have to take a position. You can't, in a court of law, you are either right or wrong. Yeah. But we know that, and that's the beautiful space of the artist. I mean, fortunately, it's quite torturous. And sometimes I would like to look at myself as an artist, and I'm not able to do probably as much as I would like to. But what that space allows is the grays and the ambiguities.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful space because that's where we live our lives. Yeah. And that's where people relate to. As a journalist or as an activist, it's either you're right or you're wrong. And there's not so much space. And I feel that is what I'm increasingly drawn towards, as to, unravel, as so to say, to the extent possible and capability, some of these processes. So how is a policy made? What is visible because the moment we understand and go backstage, for example, if you just see of a policy document, for instance, and you observe certain things and you want to try and understand why it is in this way, how do you explain it? And for instance, if you look at the people who have written it, you will see sometimes very clear relationships between the language used, between the perspective, between the value, and who has. So a policy that is written by 60 plus male who are bureaucrats and technocrats is going to be a very different policy, where even if half the people were women, or if half the people were was an artist, or the same document would be very different. So how do we make these connections, which are always going to be open to further making of connections, is the process. So, it actually, to me, increasingly doesn't matter output, or there is one thing to be told of the process, but it is to understand that process, get access to that process, which is not always very easy. Because I will not allow access to my processes, because that is in some senses I'm scared, or I don't want to reveal something, or I want to hide something, or I'm not sure of myself. So, but getting backstage can be very, very fascinating. And I think the more we go backstage in policy making, in science, in technology, we will see, I think, a much deeper and a wider understanding, where then we don't need to tell people what to look for. We uncover and show something, and people take what they want, but it's not even visible. Because what the book, some of the work that I have done, and I have not done so much sociology of technology, but it's only been a decade now since I started to, and it's very interesting how the socio-political context, economic context influences what happens inside laboratories and technology and workshops. So but that is where I think the challenge comes of, the question is also, how does science today have so much prominence?
Yeah.
How is it that everybody wants to be scientific?
Yeah.
The claim to acceptance is to be scientific. So there is, I think, in the modern imagination, there is something about whether it's the method of science or what is it? There is something to being scientific.
It's about the truth of things. That if you're scientific, you're talking about the truth of nature, the nature of nature.
So at one level, yes, but then it starts to get more complicated also. So that perhaps is but can you not get truth from other sources? Science has to be the only way of getting truth. So is it about the peer review process that allows for some contestation? I don't know. I mean, and there are people who've done more work, but I find it very fascinating that all efforts are towards being considered scientific. And at the same time, there is, if you go to policy, policy says we need evidence. If you go to science, they say the policymaker has to make the decision. These are not necessarily scientific decisions. So there's actually, it's a very interesting thing where policymakers want scientific evidence because that is the source of, in their belief, and scientists will say we don't know. I mean, a scientist is always that is a fundamental idea. So I look at the whole thing. I mean, I think the corona thing and the vaccine discussion and debate and all what's happening with, what is the scientific evidence that we know on based on which any policy is being made? So I think this
just observational mostly, even
yeah. So is there a scientific basis to the lockdown or whatever it might be?
Yeah.
Where so everybody is struggling, and this is that space of not knowing, of uncertainty. So how do we act in those positions, situations? I think is a challenge. I think for a long time, I think science seemed to offer those solutions. But in moments of tremendous crisis and uncertainty, then it seems that even that is not necessarily the best way to, or not the best way may not be the right, but is that the way to go about doing it? Because there's so much uncertainty there as well.
Would you like to take us as an example backstage, some observations of the backstage, what you're saying of the process?
So I can say a few things, for example, of the laboratories that I studied and which you have read and you mentioned. So if I say that the laboratory is believed to be a very well organized, neatly structured space, a lot of people will say no, that's not true. But I mean, the idea of the the lab coated, white lab coat, looking through microscope, and that's what I write in Instrumental Lives, which you if you remember, is that how messy a laboratory space is, and that's not the idea of the lab in a conventional sense. So now, why that image gets created, who creates that image, whether it is deliberate or what are the processes, one does not know. But so the most common things, and there's one paragraph in the book where I write about what I see on a table in a laboratory: double stick tape, pliers, nuts, aluminum vessels in our old houses where we boil water with, plastic, wires, tubes. So it's like complete mess. So it's out of this mess that one sees in the laboratory that you don't otherwise expect that to be. One other very fascinating thing in the other laboratory that I found, and I write about it in the other book, and there's some work on that, is in a lab with multiple researchers, in this case doctoral students in a scientific lab, how each working bench side by side, where the boundaries are drawn, how fascinatingly different they are from each other. How each is a reflection of the personality of that person. Some are absolutely clean, spick and span, everything in place, and some are so messy. There are food crumbs, there's a Ganesha picture, there is a statue of the god, there's music playing, there is spilt chemical, there's a computer on. So each one, there are books, there are no books. So each one is a reflection of that person's personality. And what do you do with it? I don't know, but it's such a fascinating thing when you start looking at it that way. How do people work with instruments? So in the thesis and in the other book, I did there's a small photo feature, there's a photo annexure, where scientists in one particular lab, mainly doctoral students, I asked them to identify their most favorite instrument, and then I did portraits of them posing with that instrument. And it's in black and white, it's in monochrome, it's there as an annexure in the thesis and the other book. What was very interesting is that they identified as their favorite instrument as the most useful instrument. So there was already a translation taking place. And the range of things that they identified, including a refrigerator. I mean, you're talking of a nanoscience laboratory and you would think of God knows what. One scientist identified an atomic force microscope, and he said, this is my favorite instrument for this. That instrument costs 2 crores of rupees. And there was another person who said the micropipette, because it allows me, very accurate measurements.
Yeah.
So then I got them to kind of pose with their instruments in the laboratory, and I did this feature. It was fascinating. So right from a more sophisticated instrument that nobody understands to somebody saying, another lady saying, the refrigerator. Why? Because my samples are very important for me, and the refrigerator is the place where I store my samples. Now, refrigerator as an instrument in a laboratory, we never think of that.
Yeah.
So, things like that. There was, in the same laboratory, there was a very interesting conversation where there was an instrument where it had stopped working, and that was because there was a part that was missing, or there was a gap. But then they got it to work, and how they explained it was, they said, we fooled the instrument to believe that that part is there.
Right.
They didn't actually, because they couldn't replace the part.
Right.
So the kind of challenges that they kind of face, stuff like that, and also that instrument laboratory, the story of which you've read, the kind of materials and resources that he used and that scientists used to create cutting edge instruments, that's absolutely amazing. It's a completely jugaad kind of thing in the Indian context.
Yeah.
Which they will not, scientists say, we don't do jugaad, we do science, we do innovation. So, there are many, many interesting stories like that. How much time you spend?
Away the veneer of this pure scientific method into a human process.
Absolutely.
And it brings us closer to the idea of the process, which we don't, well, you can call them messy, but the complexity is also messy because we're not able to make sense of it, in a sense.
Yeah. The other one point is, it's interesting how that image of science is clean, and how does that happen? Who's responsible for that?
Yeah.
Because scientists are, I think, very aware of the complexities of the world that they're dealing with. They're going to be, on a majority, my sense is that they're not going to just stand up and say, we know, because they know that they don't know. They're constantly trying stuff out.
Yeah.
So I think it's a combination of something that makes that image, that creates those imaginaries, those imaginations.
Instrumentalizing science in some ways, would you say? For
maybe
other purposes, to create that image?
So whether it is an instrumentalization or the other way around, why is the instrumentalization needed? I don't know. I mean, what is the benefit of instrumentalizing that science? So, you know what I mean? It could be both ways. Where do you start?
It serves the politics of capital and power in some senses.
That's another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
But then why? Who's allowing that to happen? And I mean, one can go on asking questions.
Yeah. So you raised a very interesting question of how policy is made and how the constituents of the policy group change and are visible in the policy it's made. And this has been an ongoing debate of how development of these ecosystems take place, about diversity in whose development, whose voice, who's deciding, whose perspective. This is an ongoing debate, but there's also a paucity of the idea of accepting this in policy, that this diversity of opinions is required in policy. I remember I have been part of several policy and standards groups. And I think I've been there because, of course, as an activist, but also because I'm an engineer. So I'm sort of in the same terrain and I can speak the language. So I'm sort of welcome there. I've never seen a sociologist or somebody from the social sciences or the humanities to be part of these scientific groups, in a sense, even though we are dealing with technology in human systems. So there's a separation of how we think technology is, what it is, and you're also laying sort of another view on how it comes to be, in a sense, and how it then becomes part of systems where in societal systems, in a sense. This whole idea of norms, the normatives of environmental standards, where are these norms coming from? That this is the level at which harm occurs and we don't need to exceed it. These are technology, economic, and politically driven norms, in a sense. There's no, the science is equal across whatever norm you might draw, but depends, it's a decision which science will offer you a justification for, no matter what your decision is going to be. You can just use, because the science across all norms, where you might put a 10 norm or a 15 norm, you find different scientific things to support it, because it depends what you want to achieve. So in this slippery slope of how we think of nature, in a sense, and use science as a mechanism to justify decisions, which gets reflected in things like the EIA. Of course, there's another corruption of the EIA, which is about just sheer corruption of the process itself. It's nothing to do with science, it's just to do with a corrupt practice, in a sense. The question I have in my mind is, so what do we need to rectify in this? Is it the rectification of our idea of something? Is it the rectification of the diversity of perspectives? Or where will we, how will this, how will we change this ongoing assault?
So I think all the things that you're saying, of course, probably need to be done. But I also feel that if you're able to make aware, make ourselves aware and the systems aware and people aware of the embeddedness of the value systems, again, that going back to that uncovering kind of thing and saying that, this is what's happening. And it may be a long process, it may not be an immediate solution. But I think one can only, there's no quick fix, because policy making, I always think, for instance, that it's very easy as an academic or an activist to criticize, but put yourself in the position of the policy maker who has to make this policy within a time frame. So what is it that I can do? And I don't want to be in that position. It's not an enviable position at all. So I think making it's a long process. It's a long story there, but making people and systems aware of what's going on might allow people to correct the ways that they decide to go ahead, rather than say this is what you should be doing or this is what you should be. So, for example, can there be one policy on some things? Okay, or do we need to have? There's this, for example, because it's an easy example for me, is there's a document called Technology Vision India 2035, which has a very interesting history. We have written about it and have some interesting insights on that. Two things that I kind of come to a conclusion is that who are the people writing the vision? And this is that example I gave you. It's, if you look at the steering committee, these are 60 plus male, exclusively male bureaucrats, technocrats, and scientists. There's nobody, not a single woman.
This is a very typical policy.
Correct.
There might be one or two women here and there.
Correct.
This is a very typical policy.
So I think one is that this kind of forced diversity that has come through represented. So the moment you have somebody else there, it's one step in the right direction, because you will see a reflection of a policy, which is an India policy for all of us, just through the lens of half a set of people, not even one set of people. The moment within the limitations, you make it like 50% women, or you say one artist, one sociologist, one fisherman, of course, it's not easy to do that, but you will see a change. You will see at least some dynamism and some difference of opinion, and how they deal with it is a second step. The other I felt, for example, is can a country like India have one vision?
Mm.
Why not have multiple? What's the problem with multiple visions?
Mm.
And again, it has its challenges, but I think there is experience in this world, there's experience in this country. It need not be one vision, because how can, whose vision is uniform? I mean, and it becomes a kind of an imposition. So maybe some of these things also, which are again more process oriented rather than what should I say, are procedural rather than normative in that sense, might open up the spaces. So how can one represent, how many people will you represent, and what representation can you bring in? And then can you claim it to be an India policy? Who is this Indian then? So are we aware of those realities?
How does one go about making people aware about this? Because it goes to the heart of sustainability question.
I think we have our 2-3 tools that we have, Ravi. I think writing is there. There is any communication to the extent can be done through whatever medium, whatever media, is all that we can do. I mean, in education, there's probably a different kind of possibility. In media, there is a different kind of possibility. So, and it's not going to be easy because these are big inheritances and these are big structures that one is dealing with, but maybe one step at a time, because that's all we can do. If we can uncover and show something to one individual, I think it's better than not being able to show it to another individual. So, for example, in the islands, going back, so this island is how would the world look if I was an islander? Now we are looking at the islands as a adjunct of the nation state, that far away, the periphery. But if I'm in the islands, then I am the center of my world. Then Delhi is the periphery. Delhi is far away. So far away islands, for a person in the islands are not far away.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's perspective. So you change the, what does the world look like for a turtle? I mean, is that empty space? That's the empty space, the terra nullius idea that Vishwajit Pandya and all others are writing about. This is not empty spaces. There is history, there is memory, there is physicality, there is ownership, there are trees standing there, there are turtles who come and nest, there are communities that have been living for thousands of years.
What does empty space mean in the
in any way? I mean, which space is empty?
Yeah.
Where we test our weapons, where we dig up the mines or we dam the rivers. What is empty? Nothing is empty. So I think if we are able to inform people of that, and if they still decide to go ahead, I feel it's okay. Because then you're taking the decision in the clear knowledge and understanding that it is not empty.
Yeah.
I think which is different from taking a decision in the belief that it is empty.
I totally agree.
I think to that extent, I think it'll change, because I know when I tell the stories of the island, I know people are seeing that. So how can you say it's empty? So there is this, just as a quick, not closing, but I've been able to tell the story of the islands, and I just want to emphasize that here because I found that very productive, is to talk of the islands and by extension, any system that we are part of as being located at a tri-junction of fragility and vulnerability. And I'm talking of a tri-junction, which is both, what might be called environmentally deterministic of, in a temporal sense of the geology for coming first, then the ecology, then the socio-cultural context, where the geology influences the ecology and where the geology and ecology influences the socio-cultural context, language, dress, food, housing, etc. And of course, that is a little environmental deterministic, which is problematic, but as a starting point and entry, but also to use those three axes, the geological, ecological, socio-cultural, as the three legs of a tripod, where each one is interlinked. Each one is as important for the other, for the tripod to remain standing. Yeah. And constant change is going to be there. Change is there. Right. Are we aware of the changes? Are we aware of the processes of nature? Are we aware how the river flows? Are we aware how the deserts perform? Are we aware of the fact that the Andamans are earthquake prone? That change. If we are aware of that change, we will think twice before suggesting a nuclear power station there.
Right.
And at the same time, to realize that intervention also disturbs one of those legs of that tripod,
Mm.
and that system collapses.
Yeah.
So it's linked up to what you were saying earlier of the web that we talk of.
Yeah.
And I've been able to make it very explicit in the Andaman context because I have some experience there.
Mm.
And I think we should be able to apply this across. So, for example, the idea that rivers flow waste to the sea.
Mm.
I mean, it's at the heart of engineering, right? It's the heart of the civil engineering.
Water going to the sea is wasted.
Is waste. I mean, what logic is that? I mean, what happens to the coastal ecosystems?
It's still said in the dam reports.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
I'm making reports.
Exactly. So I think if we can open up that discussion and say, are you sure that the water is going waste to the sea? Because here is a mangrove system that dies when the water doesn't come there.
Yeah.
Or here is what happens to the coastal ecology when. So this thing is something that the same tripod example may be useful, and that's emerged from studying the islands, and I've been able to use it quite effectively because people don't know. And I think one thing is that I think knowledge, we all believe, not necessarily always helps, but at least we should know, and then that might be the first step to some.
That's just a closing question. Of you've had now many years of activism, of conceptual understanding as an academic, and questioning, direct experience with many processes of ecological environmental change and difficulties. What do you think?
I feel that I want to be able to. So I think there's hope. I mean, it's not like it's but I want to be able to help instigate, catalyze people into uncovering what we take for granted.
Right.
And if I can do that with a few people, I'm good with. I don't want to make any more change because it's not difficult. I mean, how perspective matters.
Take them backstage.
Take them backstage. Take them back. Absolutely. I think if we can start to see that, just if you have time, there's this very nice map of South Asia that Himal put out with Sri Lanka on the top.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen that.
I've not seen it, but I'll look it up.
So many years ago, it's an amazing map. And what I do in my class is I have one class and I show this map, and half the class will say this is a wrong map. Then I throw a ball. I say, what is the top of the ball and what is the bottom of the ball? There's nothing.
Yeah.
But it is so embedded that the north has to be top for good reason. But that's not reality.
Yeah.
And they are stunned. And then you suddenly realize that. So how we can, it's going to be an endless process of
unlock the learnings we've had.
It's like peeling an onion. I mean, then you'll say, why should it be south? Why should it be east? Why can't it be? Then it's an endless, but I think that's okay.
Yeah.
I think we're not questioning enough.
Yeah.
We're not questioning deep. We're not questioning enough.
Yeah.
And I think that process is the only thing that I think is important. That's the only thing I am capable of now anymore. So
wonderful conversation, Pankaj. Thank you so much.